I would like to introduce Jennifer Tibbitts-Knudsen, who is the Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor and is with the Colorado District Attorney's Council. Jennifer?
Well, thank you very much for having me. I am very humbled to be here, mainly because in this session, I feel like I'm speaking for the thousands of people who are out there working today in the front lines who aren't here to speak on behalf of the challenges that they face every day. So I want to start out with a few caveats, and our speakers this morning have already hit on a few things that I'm going to reiterate. But I think we can all agree that cannabis is everywhere. So with that, and I apologize here, okay. I was a line deputy in 2004. And of course we had DUIs with drugs back then, and we still have DUIs with drugs, but now we have DUIs that are multi-substance always. We also have a much stronger defense, more litigious. We have the industry present in our capitals. And so this changes the outlook and creates more and more challenges for us every day. Another caveat. I want you to think about a brand new prosecutor. Maybe it's a second career, or maybe they went all the way through school. They're 25, they just graduated law school, and they are in a courtroom and have 2,500 cases. Maybe half of them are DUIs, but they've got domestic violence, they've got many other types of cases. And now we want them to be an expert in pharmacology. We want them to know the drug expert and classification program inside and out. But of course, they don't have desk time. They don't have the ability to bring in the witnesses they have because they don't have enough money. And you can pick your profession. It could be law enforcement, treatment. Many of our detox centers closed. So if we're talking about prevention here, what do those prosecutors do to help that person not come back? And you all know that this is a real issue. So last caveat, we know that there are data limitations. And we know there are big holes. We just talked about a lot of them. But what complicates things is, say, in Colorado, I say we commercialize. So when we opened stores in 2014, we had no idea how many DUIs involving cannabis we had prior to that date, right? We've always had DUI with cannabis. It's not like a new thing. But how many did we have? What is changing? I mean, anecdotally, we can say a bunch of different things. I can tell you that my most proficient drug recognition experts who work on DUIs every single day in the city and county of Denver were pulled off of DUI enforcement from many different duties over the last year. And so, of course, when the media says, well, DUIs are going down, well, there's more behind that, right? So we have to acknowledge those limitations when we're thinking about challenges and how do we move forward. I mentioned before that I was a line deputy way back in 2004 and that things changed. I can share this with you. You don't need to see, the details of it, but I wanted to point out a few things. So on the right-hand side with convictions, with both 0.08 BAC, so we have alcohol, and then we have THC results with delta 9, THC being over 5 nanograms per milliliter. The conviction rates are nearly the same. But I can tell you, for those prosecutors walking into the courtroom with those cases involving drugs, they are much harder cases, unless, for example, we still know meth is king, right? Meth is everywhere. We know that they're driving on meth. That case is easier because meth is still mostly offensive to people. But when we talk about drugs or in jurisdictions where drugs are being legalized, that setting is much different. And this is where our prosecutors, and I kept saying to myself this morning, man, I wish I had a bunch of subpoenas with me because I would hand them out in this room for my prosecutors and take some of our experts home, because we have probably fewer than 10 toxicologists who will come testify in these cases. Colorado's a pretty big state. How do they decide where to go and what case? It's pretty much whoever gets a subpoena first. This one is for Mr. Swift. I put this up there because many times people will ask about Colorado data, but there's a huge challenge, and it just comes down to simple word use. And when we're talking about traffic safety and impaired driving together. And he mentioned one, and so I say this is for Brian's mom and dad. We shouldn't be talking about fatalities. We should be talking about mom and dad, aunt and uncle. These are people. And not only do we have the fatalities, but think about the number of injuries. The CDC reports the number of injuries from these cases as being outrageous. I mean, the number is simply outrageous. And if we look at, people will say, well, 132, that's not that many fatalities. That's 132 people. That's 132 too many. Let's think about the word, we call it the A word. This is for my friend Joanne in the back corner there. Are these cases ever an accident? We don't have to prove, there's no mens rea, so I don't have to prove that somebody knowingly took a drug, got in a car, and killed someone. We just have to show that there was a voluntary act that they got in the car. But the more we can just even take those small words will change the discussion when we think about the issues that we have in enforcement and beyond. How many of you have heard the 3 E's of traffic? Right, we've got enforcement, engineering, education. I'm coming from the perspective of enforcement and education. So engineers, you have to help me. But if we think about all of the challenges, it starts with enforcement and before, but then it spreads because every single person who reads that newspaper is a potential juror. Every friend that we go home and talk to is a potential juror. And this stuff is hard for them to realize and to know, right? The law. So we talk about challenges for all of us, whether you have zero tolerance, a per se law, or a generic impairment law, the conversation is different. Let's think about Utah for a minute, my neighbor. They just went to 05 for alcohol. We're looking at that. That's fabulous. Colorado has had a permissible inference, so that's the inference down there at the bottom, since before 1950 that was for 0.05. So if we think about other drugs, because Utah also used to have a law that prohibited any carboxy in the blood at the time of driving. But what happened? Colorado commercialized marijuana, and then when the drivers come in and talk to the prosecutor, because carboxy was found in the blood, they were found guilty. Just, based on that, we don't have to show anything else. What's the argument? What does the defense say? My client was on vacation in Grand Junction, which is a few miles across the border, and in Colorado, in Grand Junction, it is his constitutional right to use that drug. And so the carboxy in the blood that you see today in the waste product, right? That's not fair. So what do we do? So in the conversation, when we're looking at laws, at policy, we have to consider what is going to come after. And I heard someone say we need to be more proactive and not reactive, but I'll tell you, because in my office, I don't lobby, but my boss and 2 other attorneys lobby. It's 3 of them against, a whole team of people on every bill if we're going to talk about drugs, especially marijuana. So that's really hard. This one is key for a lot of us, whether you're in treatment, prosecution especially, but what is the definition of drug? We've already hit upon it. We are way behind the drug industry, whether it's prescription or whether it's illegals, right? You just change a little bit of the molecule and then bam, our lab can't see it because that's the whole point of them changing the drugs. They can't see it. What about the costs? If we have a more generic definition, then is the law constitutional? Then we have a different definition in the drug evaluation and classification program. So sometimes we can make our arguments there. But when we think about all the designer benzos, the synthetics, it really can. We can lose a lot just on one single word in a book. And, oh, okay, I don't know what happened. Some of the graphics aren't showing up, but nonetheless, think about tools, think about our law enforcement. Bless them for being on the front lines today, because we are losing them quicker than we can count. What tools can we give law enforcement that will help? I want you to think about this, because we talk about data. We want to know how many people are using a particular drug while they're driving, right? There may be new SFSTs developed for law enforcement. But are we really telling the brand new patrol officer to walk up to the window and say, oh man, I think this is cannabis, so now I have to administer this set of tests instead of the SFSTs? So let's talk about the challenges to the SFSTs and what law enforcement is going through. The main argument that we get multiple times a week in our state is that they are not validated for drugs other than alcohol. So again, think about, we have a misdemeanor case and it's a first DUI, and that should be important just as much as the other case. First time DUI, got a newer prosecutor, and we have a veteran defense attorney. So I was working a few days ago with a bunch of SMEs from Colorado on some toolkits to help with these particular issues. We're doing writing. And one of our DRE course managers says, Jen, how come this defense motion is 1 page? And how come the prosecution response is always like 40? It wasn't really that long, it shouldn't be that long. But why is it? And why are these cases hard for us? Well, I just looked on my phone, and the National Archives is about 4-ish miles away, right? And within that building, allegedly, right, there is the original Constitution, other documents. So as a prosecutor, as a law enforcement officer, we take the oath that we're going to protect everyone's rights, and that I have to prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt. But what is that? Where is the balance? Because I can tell you, prosecutors from our law enforcement, I know we have some law enforcement here, we would want you to give us an entire stack of paper and evidence and that case be perfect, but there is no such thing. Because that officer has to go right back out, and maybe that report isn't even written, that night. And so how do you find that balance for our people who don't have the resources? And what is it that we can do to lower the time that we spend in court? One of our THC cases took over 3 years to litigate. It was a misdemeanor. That's obviously a very extreme case, but these aren't just simple hearings. I also like to advocate that one of the things that is a challenge for us is that we see a lot of times the basic core skills, knowledge, right? If we talk about SFSTs, the ability to conduct that, if we talk about prosecutors, just knowing how to go in and conduct a trial. These cases would be so much easier if we built upon those particular basics. We already have NHTSA has given a lot of great little nuggets in those manuals, but they're only great if you know that they're there, right? So how do we get that education? How do we get the person out of court to be able to go to that class? Sometimes in law enforcement, we have backfill, so we'll pay to have somebody go in and fill in for that person so they can go to training, but not a lot. And then let's talk about ARIDE, that bridge the gap class between SFSTs and DRE. A lot of times it was pumped, well, let's do it in the academies before they've ever done a DUI case ever. That's a whole nother discussion. But for us in the courtroom, the question is, well, now they've got new knowledge and new tests. So I want to make them an expert, number one, in court. And those tests aren't validated, so we should throw them out. And then all of a sudden, I have a defense attorney saying, Trooper, you went through A-RIDE. And the toxicologist, I hope you appreciate this back there. They say, you went through A-RIDE. Tell me, how much of this particular benzodiazepine that the toxicology lab found, how much would it take of that benzo to cause HGN in the woman sitting here? And the trooper's scared, right? But she shouldn't be expecting, nobody knows that answer. So here lies the problem, right? There's our education piece. When we commercialized, law enforcement did get a chunk of the tax money from cannabis. So what did we do? We pumped as many people through DRE school as we could. I think we did 2 or 3 schools a year for a while. But if anyone, has anyone read Good to Great? It's a leadership book. It's got kind of a red, yeah, Jim Collins, good book, good read if you have not read it. He talks about getting the right person in the right seat of the bus so you can get the bus to where it's going. I'm really butchering it, but that's the point. I think it's the same thing with the DRE program. We can't just pick 12 people and send them to DRE school. It has to be those people who have the passion, the basics down, and that really want to be there. Sorry. We're out of time? Okay. All right, well, I'll end on this then. Don't just pump your DREs through DRE school, because now we have fewer than we would have before if we had just kind of maintained that program. Find the people, put the right people in the right seat, and it will help get you there. Thanks.
We have the opportunity now to ask some questions of Jennifer. We've got roving microphones in here, or are there anything online?
We have a question over here.
Uh-oh.
Hi there, Jake Nelson, AAA. Jen, good talk. I have a question for you about the definition of drug. So I heard Dr. Moore talk about how, what was it, cannabis, cocaine, and meth, that's the bulk of what you see in the lab. And so maybe there's no benefit to having a more general definition of drug. Maybe just referring to scheduled substances is sufficient. But I've heard anecdotally stories from states where because the statute is so specific in listing very specific drugs, that if there is a drug found in a driver that is contributing or solely responsible for an observed impairment in a DUI crash, whether somebody was injured or not, if it's not in statute, then you can't bring the charge. Is that, how common is that? And is maybe referring to the list of scheduled substances, I think it's referred to in public health code sometime in many states, and then also adding on, or any substance that could cause impairment to the slightest degree that renders somebody incapable of driving safely, like as an, like just an add-on clause. Is that the way to solve for that problem? What do you propose?
So I think it is a very large issue. I mean, we think about fentanyl analogs. If they are only on the schedule temporarily, for example, and if Congress, or if it's not renewed, what do we do with that? So it's iffy whether we just rely on the schedule. We think about kratom or COT, some of those other things that are coming to be more popular. They're sold everywhere. It's hard to say because we've got federal. I think Alabama might have, Bill can talk to this, if you have a state schedule, plus you have a statute. I think the bigger thing too is to make sure that all of the law is cohesive. So for example, for cannabis, we have different definitions in the Constitution than we do in Title 18, which is our criminal code. And so it's really critical when you're looking at that to make sure there aren't gaps, and if there are gaps, is there an add-on that you can say like this drug and analogs, or some language working with your experts to be able to bridge that gap and try to hold it as much as you can, because it's a huge issue. Inhalants too, like one of the issues is, what actually is this drug we're talking about? We know somebody did heroin, but what is Amy talking about when, like, we see 6-man, right? So these prosecutors, they don't know, what are we dealing with? Where's the definition? Generic versus name.
Very complicated, absolutely. Can we please give Jennifer a hand?